Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
When a group of amateur geologists illegally entered the abandoned Lippincott mine in Death Valley on July 21, 2016, they were looking for rare minerals, but found human horror. Deep in one of the hot adits, where the air burned the lungs even in the shade, a man sat. It was Lewis Palmer, a ranger who had been missing for exactly a week. He looked like a living mummy. His skin burned black by the sun, his lips cracked and his eyes staring into nothing. But it wasn't his physical exhaustion that was the most terrifying thing. It was what he was holding in his hands. Lewis was clutching an ordinary cardboard box, wrapped in gray tape to his chest with all his might. When the rescuers tried to take it away, he let out an animalistic roar and began to fight as if the existence of the universe depended on that piece of cardboard. This is the story of how an experienced ranger entered the desert as a master and left it as a prisoner of his own mind, broken by the silence and the temperature of 122 degrees Fahrenheit. On July 14, 2016, Death Valley lived up to its name 100%. The weather station at Furnace Creek recorded a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius, or 122 degrees Fahrenheit, before noon. The asphalt on the roads melted into a viscous black mass, and the horizon shook in a haze, distorting the outlines of the mountains. On a day like this, even the lizards hide in the shadows, and the silence in the canyons becomes heavy, almost physically tangible. Lewis Palmer, a 40-year-old ranger with 15 years of experience, was on duty in the northern sector of the park at 8 in the morning. Lewis was known by his colleagues as a man of instructions. He never took unnecessary risks, always checked his equipment twice, and knew every crack in the rocks of the Ubahibe crater area. His patrol route that day was through Titus Canyon, a narrow, winding, high-walled gorge that turned into a hot furnace in the summer. At 10 o'clock and 45 minutes in the morning, Luis got on the phone with the dispatcher. It was a standard session, and the ranger's voice sounded calm and casual, although there was strong static interference on the air. According to the radio log, Palmer reported that he was near an intersection on Racetrack Valley Road. "I see fresh truck tracks coming off the dirt road toward the restricted area," he said over the crackle of the radio. "Looks like someone decided to take a shortcut through the salt marsh. I'll check it out and get back on track in 20 minutes. The dispatcher confirmed that he had received the information. These were the last words of Luis Palmer that the world heard. Over the next few hours, the airwaves were silent. Luis did not come out for the mandatory control sessions at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and 4 o'clock in the evening. The officer on duty at the Coe Creek station did not initially attach any importance to this. The Titus Canyon and Ubahibe crater area is known for its many dead zones, where radio signals are reliably jammed by massive ironstone cliffs. This was a common practice. Patrols often disappeared from the radar for several hours until they reached a hill or open space. No one panicked, because Palmer was a veteran of the service and had never gotten into trouble. However, the situation changed when the sun began to set behind the Panamint Ridge. The temperature dropped only slightly, remaining deadly, and Luis never returned to the base to turn in his shift at 18 o'clock. At 20 o'clock in the evening, when the desert was already at dusk, his absence became critical. At 21 hours and 10 minutes, when the darkness became absolute, Senior Ranger Mike Dawson, a colleague and friend of Luis's, realized that the dead zone could not last that long. He tried to call Palmer on all emergency channels, but all he heard was a monotonous hiss. Dawson announced the distress code. Rescue protocols were activated immediately. At 22 hours and 30 minutes, a patrol car following the suspected route of the missing man noticed a faint glow in the darkness. Lewis Palmer's company pickup truck was found on the side of Titus Canyon Road. The vehicle was stationary. The engine was off, but the parking lights were on, slowly draining the battery. Inspection of the car caused experienced searchers to break out in a cold sweat. The driver's door was open wide. There was no one inside. There was a portable radio on the passenger seat, which was a gross violation of safety protocol. A ranger never leaves a means of communication when leaving a car in a dead zone. Next to the radio was a half-empty bottle of warm water and a service tablet with maps of the area. The car keys were missing. The light of the powerful flashlights picked out the clear traces of heavy-duty boots on the dusty ground. They belonged to Luis. The tracks led from the open pickup door straight into the darkness, toward a chaotic pile of rocks where there were no trails or roads. It looked as if he had gotten out of the car and walked purposefully into the heart of the stone maze. The patrolman followed the tracks for 500 yards. The prints were deep and even, indicating that Luis had walked calmly, not running or dragging his feet. But suddenly, in a stretch of rocky scree at the foot of a sheer cliff, the tracks broke off. Then there was only hard stone, which does not preserve history. The night in the canyon made it impossible to raise the helicopter because of the risk of collision with the walls of the gorge. The search operation had to be postponed until dawn, leaving Lewis Palmer alone in the night desert, where even the stones continued to radiate deadly heat, and the silence hid the answer to the question of why the experienced ranger had voluntarily gone into the middle of nowhere, leaving behind water and communication. A week of searching in Death Valley yielded no results, except for a few false tracks and one heat stroke in a member of the volunteer group. The hope of finding Lewis Palmer alive melted away with every hour spent under the scorching sun, which raised the thermometer to critical levels every day. The official search operation was gradually winding down, moving into a phase of passive monitoring, as the chances of surviving in such an area without water for 7 days were zero. The desert knew how to keep its secrets, and it seemed that the ranger had become another one of them. However, as is often the case in disappearance cases, the answer was not found by those who were looking, and not in the place they expected. On July 21, 2016, a group of 3 amateur geologists decided to explore the area of the abandoned Lippincott lead and silver mine. The area, located about 15 miles from where the ranger's abandoned pickup truck was found, was officially considered off-limits due to the state of disrepair of the mine shafts. But the prohibition signs were often ignored by adventurers. The group, consisting of 2 men and 1 woman, left their off-road vehicle on an old mining road and walked up to the entrance of the main adit. According to the testimony of one of the group members, later recorded by a sheriff's deputy, they had planned only a cursory inspection of the entrance area. Curiosity, however, led them deeper into the tunnel, where the air temperature remained relatively stable at around 30 degrees Celsius, a real escape from the hell outside. The beam of the flashlight snatched remnants of old rock and rotten fasteners from the walls, until it hit a pile of rocks in the far corner of the horizontal adit. There, in a dead end, a man was sitting with his back against the cold rock. What the geologists saw could hardly be called a person in the full sense of the word. It was an emaciated creature in the rags that had once been the uniform of the National Park Service. The man's lips were cracked to black, turning into a continuous wound. His eyes were inflamed and bloodshot, and his exposed skin was covered with third-degree sunburns that had already begun to fester. It was Lewis Palmer. He was alive, but his consciousness was somewhere very far away. What struck the witnesses the most was not the physical injury, but the behavior of the man they found. Lewis was sitting in an unnatural position, holding a square-shaped object tightly to his chest with both hands. It was an ordinary cardboard box, measuring approximately 30 by 30 centimeters, tightly wrapped with gray reinforced tape. When one of the geologists, having recovered from his shock, directed the light of his flashlight directly into the ranger's face and tried to call his name, the reaction was immediate and terrifying. Lewis showed no joy at being rescued. He let out a low, animalistic growl that echoed off the walls of the mine and began to crawl backwards, pressing himself into the rocks. His fingers turned white from the strain of clutching his cargo. He covered the box with his own body, looking at the rescuers with the look of a cornered animal protecting the last thing he had left. The geologists immediately left the mine to catch a satellite phone signal and call for help. The rescue team, which included paramedics and police officers, arrived 2 hours later. The evacuation turned into a real chaos. Lewis was in a state of severe psychosis and dehydration. He did not respond to commands, did not recognize his colleagues, and continued to defend the box. The situation became critical when it was time to load the victim onto a stretcher. Luis physically refused to open his arms. His muscles were so spasmodic and his mental resistance so strong that 3 strong medics had to use brute force. The process resembled a struggle with a madman. At the moment when the box was finally wrested from his hands, an inhuman, hysterical scream swept through the cave. It was the scream of a man whose life had been taken away. Luis screamed and convulsed until painful shock and exhaustion shut down his consciousness. Paramedics immediately began to stabilize the ranger's condition, preparing him for helicopter transportation. Meanwhile, the law enforcement officer's attention turned to the object that almost cost Luis his life. The box was lying on the rocky floor of the adit, illuminated by tactical flashlights. It looked absolutely ordinary. Cheap cardboard, roughly wrapped with construction tape. There were no markings, inscriptions, or warning signs. The police officer who conducted the initial inspection acted with utmost caution. There was a possibility that there were drugs, cartel money, or even an improvised explosive device inside. The darkest assumptions were about biological remains, possibly a human head, which would be a typical message from criminal groups that sometimes use the desert for their own purposes. The policeman pulled out a penknife. In the silence of the mine, the sound of the duct tape being cut seemed deafening. He made a careful cut along the top flap, then across. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, he bent the cardboard flaps back. The flashlight beam struck the inside of the box. The officer froze, not believing his eyes. He shone the light from different angles, expecting to see a hidden bottom or microscopic traces of a substance. But there was only darkness inside. No drugs, no money. No ransom note. There was not even dust. The box that the dying ranger had guarded with his sanity for a week in the heat of hell was completely empty. Dear friends, before we continue to dive into this tangled story, I have a small request. If you like investigations like this and want to see more content like this, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comments below. This helps YouTube's algorithms understand that this topic is interesting and promote the video so that it can be viewed by as many people as possible. Thank you for your support. And now we return to a hospital room in Las Vegas, where a desert survivor is fighting her own invisible battle. On July 22, 2016, Lewis Palmer was airlifted to Sunrise Hospital in Las Vegas by helicopter. The intensive care unit greeted him with sterile silence and the beeping of monitors, in stark contrast to the week of hellish wind noise in the mine. The doctors immediately diagnosed acute kidney failure and rhabdomyolysis, a condition in which muscle tissue begins to break down due to extreme exertion and dehydration, poisoning the blood with decay products. His body was a continuous wound, but his physical condition was stabilized on the second day of intensive care. However, the ranger's mental state remained critical and frightening. Lewis did not speak. He was lying on a hospital bed, looking at one point on the ceiling, completely ignoring the presence of his wife and medical staff. But the most frightening thing was what his hands were doing. Even in his sleep, under the influence of strong sedatives, his palms remained bent at right angles in front of his chest, and his fingers were clenching the air tensely. The muscle memory of horror was so strong that he continued to hold the invisible box, believing that his life depended on it. Doctors called it a catatonic stupor, caused by post-traumatic stress disorder. But to detectives, it looked like mute evidence of prolonged torture. The investigation was led by Detective Mark Reynolds of the Inyo County Sheriff's Office. Reynolds was a veteran who had seen many deaths in the desert, but this case broke all the molds. He had a living witness who couldn't talk, and physical evidence that was empty. The cardboard box that Luis had defended with such vigor became the central object of examination in the crime lab. The first results of the analysis came back on July 23rd. Experts found that it was a standard corrugated cardboard packaging container. The markings on the bottom indicated a batch produced in 2015 by order of the company Apex Logistics Solutions. This name did not tell the investigators anything. There was no such company in the database of local carriers, which suggested a fictitious enterprise or a one-day company. More interesting were the results of chemical analysis of the inner surface of the box. Although it was visually empty, sensitive instruments revealed microscopic traces of polymer clay, a material often used by artists or modelers. In addition, the cardboard inside retained a faint but persistent odor of acetone, an industrial solvent. It was a strange combination, clay and solvent. It didn't fit with the version of drug trafficking or money transportation. No fingerprints were found on the surface, except for those of Louis Palmer himself and the rescuers. This indicated that the person who gave the box to the ranger was wearing gloves and acting professionally. While forensic scientists were examining the cardboard, Reynolds tried to get some information from the victim's wife, Sarah Palmer. The woman was in the hospital around the clock, hoping that her husband would recognize her. During a conversation in the hospital corridor, Sarah categorically rejected the version of her husband's mental illness before the incident. "Luis was the most stable person I've ever known," she told the detective in a shaky voice. "He took annual psychological tests for his job. But a week before he disappeared, something changed." According to Sarah, around July 7th, Luis returned from his shift unusually quiet. He sat in the kitchen for a long time, studying maps of the Titus Canyon area. When she asked him what was wrong, he answered cryptically, "I found something there that shouldn't be there. It's not tourists or nature." When asked to explain, he said he had to collect evidence first. "He was afraid to report to his superiors without the facts," Sarah recalled. "He said that if he was wrong, they would just laugh at him and retire him. He wanted to make sure for himself." Sarah's words gave the investigation a new direction. Luis was not the victim of a random attack. He was purposefully looking for something in the desert, and that something found him. The combination of the name of an unknown logistics company, traces of modeling materials, and the ranger's strange behavior formed a disturbing mosaic. The emptiness in the box was not just the absence of evidence, it was the evidence itself, an instrument of torture designed by someone with sadistic ingenuity. Reynolds realized that the key to the mystery lay not in the hospital, but in the origins of the company, Apex Logistics Solutions, whose name led the detective to an address that should have existed only on paper. On July 24, 2016, while doctors in Las Vegas fought to restore Lewis Palmer's consciousness, Detective Mark Reynolds sat in his office in Independence, surrounded by stacks of papers. The name of the company on the label of the cardboard box, Apex Logistics Solutions, was the only clue that could lead to the organizers of this horror. However, as Reynolds quickly found out, this thread led to a legal void. An official request to the Commercial Enterprise Registry showed that Apex was a classic one-day firm registered in Delaware at a mass registration address where thousands of similar ghosts were per mailbox. The company had no website, no real assets, and no employees. It was a dead end created by lawyers to hide shady operations. But every company, even the most ghostly, must have a physical footprint if it is to be involved in transportation. Reynolds turned to Nevada tax records and found what he was looking for. 3 months ago, a warehouse on the outskirts of the town of Beatty was rented in the name of Apex Logistics. This small community, located just a few miles from the eastern border of Death Valley National Park, was ideal for those who wanted to remain undetected while having quick access to the desert. That afternoon, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Reynolds, accompanied by 2 Nye County Sheriff's deputies, arrived in Beatty. The heat was unbearable, the thermometer reading 42 degrees Celsius. The warehouse they were looking for turned out to be an old corrugated metal shed on the edge of town, where the asphalt turned to hot gravel. The rusty gate bore a faded "Private Area" sign, and the windows were painted white from the inside. With a search warrant, the police cut off the padlock. When the heavy gate creaked open, they were greeted by a stifling wave of hot air that smelled of dust and oil. The hangar was almost empty. The organizers had managed to clean up the place, but they did it in a hurry. In the corner, near a makeshift workbench, forensic experts found a pile of garbage that had not been burned. Among the scraps of plastic and paper, Reynolds saw familiar objects: scraps of gray reinforced tape and pieces of cardboard. The markings on the cardboard matched exactly what was on the box Luis was holding. This was direct evidence that it was here, in this nondescript hangar, that the Rangers' torture tools were being prepared. While the forensic team was collecting evidence, Reynolds decided to interview local residents. The nearest building was an old motel, the Desert Rose Inn, located across the street. Its owner, an elderly man named Earl, initially did not want to talk to the police, but when he heard about the Rangers' disappearance, he changed his anger to mercy. His testimony became key to understanding the logistics of the criminals. "I saw them," Earl said, squinting against the sun. "They only came out at night. A black cargo pickup, heavy, with reinforced suspension. No license plates, not even temporary ones. They never turned on their headlights when they left the hangar. They only drove on the lights." According to the witness, the truck never took the main Highway 95. Instead, it turned onto old mining roads that led directly to the mountains and the border of the national park. These were roads that no one had used in half a century, except for smugglers who knew how to avoid the patrols. Meanwhile, the digital forensics lab completed work on the onboard computer of Lewis Palmer's official Ford. Although the criminals took the keys and radio, they did not know that modern patrol cars record telemetry regardless of the driver's actions. The resulting GPS data completely changed the picture of that fateful day. Reynolds opened the map on the hood of his car, comparing the official patrol route with the tracker data. What he saw left him breathless. On July 14th, At 11 hours and 15 minutes, Luis's car abruptly changed course. Instead of following the patrol route, the Ranger turned onto a barely visible dirt road and drove 7 miles deep into the canyon, into an area that was marked on the maps as impassable. But the most disturbing thing was what happened next. The tracker showed that the car stopped at the dead end of the canyon at 11 o'clock and 40 minutes and stood there, motionless, for exactly 40 minutes. The engine was idling. Then the car turned around and drove back to the place where the searchers found it at night. These 40 minutes were a black hole in the investigation. It was during this period of time that something happened that forced the experienced officer not to call for backup, not to report a change of route, but to silently accept his fate. He didn't just disappear. He met someone at that point. And that someone made him return to the road, leave the car, and walk into the desert with a box in his hands. Reynolds circled the stopping point on the map with a red marker. The coordinates pointed to a narrow gorge hidden from prying eyes by high rocks. The detective realized that this was where he needed to go to find out the truth, even if it could be deadly. He got in the car, started the engine, and looked at the mountains that were darkening in the west, hiding the crime scene that was waiting for him in silence. On July 25, 2016, a scream broke the silence of the intensive care unit at Sunrise Hospital. Louis Palmer, who had been in a deep catatonic stupor, suddenly regained consciousness. It was not an awakening in the usual sense. It was an abrupt return to a nightmare that had never ended for him. When the night shift nurse tried to adjust his IV, Louis grabbed her arm so hard that he left bruises. His eyes darted around the room, looking for something that wasn't there, and his lips whispered a set of words that at first seemed to the staff to be delirium caused by the powerful drugs. Weight matters. You can't change the weight. It will work. Don't let go. Just don't let go. He repeated over and over again, looking at his empty hands, which continued to hold the invisible weight in front of his chest. The psychiatrist on duty, Dr. Alan Crawford, who was urgently called to the ward, recorded the condition of an acute psychotic episode in the medical record. However, after listening to the recording of the patient's delirium, he made a conclusion that changed the course of the entire investigation. Crawford explained to Detective Reynolds that Louis's behavior did not resemble chaotic hallucinations. It was a clear instruction driven into the subconscious mind due to extreme stress. The Ranger was convinced that he was part of a mechanism, a living detonator, and any movement of his hands would lead to disaster. It was not just a physical trauma. It was a sophisticated, professional psychological torture designed to completely destroy a person's will without firing a single shot. This hypothesis led Reynolds to turn to the closed archives of Interpol and the databases of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He looked for analogies, and what he found made his blood run cold. In 2014, in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico, the police found the bodies of 2 federal agents. They died not from bullets, but from a heart attack and dehydration. Next to them were plastic water canisters with dummy explosives with tilt sensors attached. The cartel forced them to stand still at gunpoint, convincing them that the canisters contained mercury fuses that would detonate at the slightest movement. In reality, they contained only water. Louis Palmer was the victim of a similar experiment on the human psyche, but instead of water, he was given an empty cardboard box and the desert. Having gained a new understanding of the situation, Reynolds realized that the box was just a distraction, a way to neutralize the witness without physically killing him, so as not to attract the attention of the feds ahead of time. The main question remained. What exactly did Luis see in those 40 minutes when his car was parked in the dead end of the canyon? On July 26, at 5 o'clock in the morning, a team of investigators led by Reynolds went to the coordinates obtained from the patrol car's GPS tracker. The place where Luis was staying was in a narrow, blind pocket between two steep cliffs that perfectly jammed any radio signal. Absolute silence reigned here, broken only by the wind blowing in the gorge. The temperature was already approaching 35 degrees Celsius at dawn. We started exploring the area immediately. Behind a huge rock that created a natural canopy, the forensic team found traces of another camp. It was not a place for rest, but for waiting. There were clear prints on the sand of wide SUV tires with aggressive treads that led deep into the desert along old smuggling trails. Several cigarette butts were found in the soil, carefully buried to a depth of 6 inches, a professional habit of those who do not want to leave DNA. But the main find was waiting for them, 10 meters from where the car was parked. The ground had been dug up, and the color of the soil was different from the surrounding landscape. It looked like a fresh grave. Reynolds ordered them to dig carefully, layer by layer, expecting to find the body of an accomplice or another victim of the experiment. However, the shovels hit hard plastic and metal instead of soft tissue. From the pit, about 3 feet deep, they pulled out the mangled wreckage of some kind of device. It was not an ordinary drone for taking pictures of landscapes. The investigators were looking at the remains of a heavy military-grade drone made of matte carbon fiber with no insignia. Its rotors were shattered, as if the device had fallen from a great height or been shot down. Under the drone's wreckage were broken shipping containers. These were specialized cases made of impact-resistant polymer, which are used to transport particularly valuable or dangerous goods. Most of them were empty, their contents gone. But on one of the split cases that had survived better than the others, Reynolds saw a sticker that didn't fit any logical narcotics or weapons story. The international Biohazard symbol was burning bright orange on the black plastic. And below it, the series and protection class markings that are usually seen only in laboratories of the 4th security level. The detective slowly backed away from the pit, ordering everyone to immediately put on respirators and move to a safe distance. What Lewis Palmer interrupted in the desert was not just contraband. It was a delivery of something that could kill far more people than a cardboard box of imaginary explosives. And judging by the crashed drone, the cargo did not reach its destination, which means that someone very powerful and dangerous has lost something very important. And this someone was probably still around, looking for their lost goods. On July 28, 2016, the sterile silence of the Riverside Forensic Science Laboratory was filled with a tension that could be cut with a knife. A preliminary biohazard label on containers found in the desert had forced management to evacuate half the staff and bring in specialists in higher-level isolation suits. Everyone expected to see anthrax strains or war viruses. However, when the mass spectrometer gave the final result of the analysis of the liquid contained inside the surviving capsules, it became clear that the threat was of a completely different nature. It was not a biological weapon, but chemical death in its most concentrated form. The report of the chief toxicologist, Dr. Alice Wong, stated that the seized substance was an experimental synthetic opioid, similar to fentanyl, but with a modified molecular structure. This modification made the substance 100 times more potent than morphine and, most importantly, allowed it to be in a liquid state without losing its properties even at extreme temperatures. The biological hazard label was a clever camouflage. It ensured that a bystander or petty thief would run away from the find rather than try to steal it. The contents of just one such container, diluted to street doses, were worth millions of dollars on the black market and could kill the population of a small town. Detective Reynolds, having received the report, finally put together a complete picture of the criminal scheme. Apex Logistics was not just a front, but a key link in a high-tech smuggling chain. The use of heavy military drones allowed the drug cartel to move cargo across the border, bypassing ground checkpoints and radar detection. Death Valley, with its dead zones and lack of patrols, was an ideal place to dump the cargo. The drone would enter the canyon at an ultra-low altitude, drop the containers at a designated point, where they would be picked up by a group of off-road vehicles disguised as geologists or tourists. It was a near-perfect plan that worked flawlessly until one principled ranger decided to check out the strange tire tracks. That afternoon, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Reynolds returned to Sunrise Hospital. Lewis Palmer's condition had improved so much that the doctors allowed him to be interviewed for the first time. The ranger was still weak. His voice resembled the rustling of dry leaves, but his mind began to free itself from the shackles of the nightmare. His testimony became the foundation on which further investigation was based. Luis recalled the events of July 14th with the photographic precision often found in survivors of mortal danger. According to him, when he drove into a dead-end branch of the canyon, he saw more than just lost tourists. He caught a moment of overload. 3 men in sand-colored tactical clothing, without insignia, were loading black cases into the back of a pickup truck. Their movements were polished and professional. These were no ordinary thugs off the street. They were military trained. "They heard my engine before I saw them," Luis whispered, looking at his bandaged hands. "I didn't even have time to reach for my radio. They locked my car and pulled me out in seconds." They disarmed the ranger and forced him to kneel on the ground facing a rock. Luis was sure he would be executed on the spot. He heard the men conferring behind his back. One of them, whom the others called the commander, spoke English with a subtle accent, perhaps an Eastern European or South American one. The gist of their conversation was a pragmatic calculation. The murder of a federal employee in a national park is a cargo 200 that will attract the attention of every FBI agent in the state. There would be a massive desert search, roadblocks, and air support. It would put an end to their established supply chain. They needed Luis to disappear quietly. They needed his death to look like an accident. Heat stroke, disorientation, dehydration. But they couldn't just let him go. Then the commander proposed another solution. Sadistic, but brilliant in its cruelty. They decided to use Luis's professionalism and responsibility against him. "He came up to me with this box," Luis said, and his heart rate monitor began to accelerate its peak. "He said that inside was a gyroscopic sensor connected to a plastid charge. He explained the technical details so convincingly that I believed him. He said, 'Your life now weighs exactly the same as this box. If you drop it, if you try to open it, or if your heart rate rises from running, it will explode. We will be watching. If you go to the road, we will detonate it remotely. Your only chance is to sit quietly and wait for the timer to go off.'" It was a lie from the first to the last word. But under stress, at gunpoint, Luis's brain grabbed onto this information as the only reality. They hadn't just left him in the desert. They had given him a mission. They knew that the ranger, trained to follow protocols, would try to fulfill the condition of not dropping the cargo at the cost of his own life. They drove him 15 miles from the place of capture to the most remote corner and dumped him there, after giving him a sip of water to prolong his agony. The box became his prison, which he carried in his hands. Fear of explosion forced him to move slowly, avoid open spaces where he could be seen, and seek shelter in the mine instead of going to water sources. Reynolds listened to this confession, realizing that he was dealing with people for whom human life is simply a variable in a profit equation. But at the end of the conversation, Luis suddenly fell silent, as if remembering a detail that his mind had been blocking until recently. He looked at the detective with a look full of horror and whispered, "Before he left, the one in charge, he leaned into my ear. He didn't just threaten me. He knew my name. He knew where my wife worked. And he said one thing that I only realized now. He said, 'We will come back for what you owe us, Luis. The box is just a deposit.'" On July 29, 2016, in the intensive care unit of the Sunrise Hospital Medical Center, a conversation took place that finally dotted the I's and crossed the T's in the story of Louis Palmer's disappearance. Detective Mark Reynolds, armed with a voice recorder and notebook, was sitting at the ranger's bedside. Louis was able to sit up on his own, although his hands still shook involuntarily, trying to find an invisible support. His voice was quiet, hoarse from the effects of dehydration, but his mind was clear. What he told us was a chronicle of one of the most brutal psychological experiments law enforcement has ever faced. According to Louis, everything was decided in those fateful 40 minutes in the dead end of the canyon. When they pulled him out of the car, he expected to be executed. He saw the faces of his attackers, saw the cargo worth millions. But the man who gave the orders, a tall, lean brunette with the call sign geologist, chose a different path. He was not just a smuggler, but a former interrogation and psychological pressure specialist, as evidenced by his cold, methodical manner of communication. The geologist ordered his subordinates to bring one of the empty cardboard boxes from the back of the truck. He then walked over to Louis, who was kneeling at gunpoint, and began his performance. He pulled out a roll of gray reinforced tape and ordered the ranger to hold his hands out in front of him, palms up. "Listen to me carefully, Ranger," he said, in the tone of a teacher explaining a complex theorem. "Inside this box is a modified pressure sensor connected to 0.5 kilogram of C4 plastic explosive. The mechanism is adjusted to the weight of your hands and the stability of the horizon." Louis recalled how the geologist methodically taped cardboard to his forearms and hands. He made it tight so that the box became an extension of his body. When the last layer of tape was fixed, the leader looked directly into the eyes of his victim and announced the rules of the game, which became a sentence. "If you open your fingers, the chain will close and you will explode. If you drop it, you will explode. If you try to cut the tape or open the valve, the photocell will work and you will explode. Even if you just stumble and shake the box sharply, the gyroscope will activate the detonator. Your only chance is to get to the highway. There, on the asphalt, our observers will see you and remotely disable the signal. Go." It was a perfect lie. There was nothing in the box. No sensors, no explosives, not even sand for weight. But Louis didn't know that. For him, a professional accustomed to trusting technical data, these words were the absolute truth. He was driven 15 miles off the road into a hot salt marsh area and thrown out of the car. It was at this point that the cynical calculation of the perpetrators kicked in. They knew that Luis was an experienced ranger. In a normal situation, he would have immediately assessed the situation. He would have found shade, minimized movement during the heat of the day, dug a hole in the sand to get to a cooler layer of soil, and waited for help. He knew where the water sources were. He could have survived. But the box changed everything. It broke his survival instincts. Instead of looking for water, Luis started looking for a perfectly flat surface. He was afraid to walk on rocky paths where there was shade because he could trip. To stumble meant death. So he went out to the open salt marsh, where the sun was blazing with the power of a microwave oven, but there was a flat ground under his feet. The fear of an explosion paralyzed his logic. Every step was torture. He walked without bending his elbows, holding the box in front of him like a shrine. The muscles in his shoulders and back began to burn with fire after an hour, but he could not allow himself to lower his arms even an inch. His brain, poisoned by fear, began to paint over reality. He thought he could hear the soft ticking of a mechanism inside the cardboard. He felt a non-existent vibration. The next day, the wind started blowing. For an ordinary person, this would be a relief, but for Luis, it became a new nightmare. Gusts of hot air pushed the box, putting a strain on his arms. It seemed to him that the wind was trying to tear the detonator from his fingers. That's why he didn't go to the water source in Cottonwood Canyon. He was looking for protection from the wind. He found the Lippincott mine. The dark, deep adit seemed like a salvation. It was quiet. There was no wind to activate the gyroscope. He went inside, sat in a corner, and froze. He sat there hour after hour, day after day, afraid to move. Thirst tore at his throat. Hallucinations painted pictures of water flowing down the walls, but he couldn't reach out and touch it because his hands were busy. Luis told the detective about the most frightening moment, the fourth day. That's when he realized he was dying. His consciousness began to fade away, but his subconscious kept his hands in tension. He became a slave to a piece of cardboard. He even tried to drink his own urine, leaning towards the ground so carefully as not to change the angle of the box. But it only made his condition worse. "I hated that box," Luis whispered, a tear rolling down his cheek. "But I loved it more than life. I believed that as long as I held it, I was in control of my death. It was the only thing that made sense in that hell. They made me torture myself." This revelation shocked Reynolds. The criminals had not just left the witness to die. They turned his professional skills into a weapon against him. A ranger who could walk through the desert would die of thirst 50 meters from water because he was afraid of dropping an empty cardboard box. But at the end of his confession, Luis suddenly changed his tone. His gaze became hard, focusing on something in the past. He recalled a detail that had eluded him in the early days of his delirium. When the geologist was tying the box down, he took off his tactical gloves to get a better feel for the duct tape. He worked very close to Luis's face. "He was careful," Luis said, looking at the detective. "He didn't leave any prints on the box because he put the gloves back on. But when he was wrapping the tape, I could see his left forearm. There, on the inside, was a tattoo. It was not a picture from a catalog. It was a specific symbol. Crossed geological hammers and numbers. I remembered these numbers because I looked at them for 40 minutes while we were driving to the desert. 4172. They're not just numbers, detective. That's a surveyor's license number, and it's only issued in one state in the West. Reynolds put the notebook down. This detail changed everything. Geologist wasn't just a nickname. It was a profession. And this trail did not lead to the shadowy world of drug cartels, but to the legitimate databases of the mining industry, where every specialist with access to explosives leaves a digital fingerprint that cannot be erased. On August 14, 2016, exactly 1 month after the disappearance of Lewis Palmer, the silence of the Las Vegas suburbs was shattered by the sound of stun grenades. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, relying on the unique data obtained through the Rangers' phenomenal memory and analysis of the drone wreckage, launched the final phase of Operation Dry Ice. The information about the tattoo with the surveyor's license number that Luis noticed on the kidnapper's hand became the key that cracked the security system of the criminal syndicate. The number belonged to Victor Kaufman, a former mining engineer who was officially presumed dead in a mine collapse in 2010, but who in fact became the chief logistician for a drug cartel nicknamed the Geologist. Kaufman was arrested not in his luxurious home, but in a dusty SUV 2 miles from the Mexican border near the Otay Mesa crossing. He was trying to leave the country using a fake Canadian passport. A search of his vehicle revealed hard drives with complete drone route maps and black bookkeeping for the firm Apex Logistics Solutions. This ghost firm has been using national parks as gray areas for synthetic drug trafficking for years, believing that rangers are a minor obstacle that can be easily intimidated or bypassed. The trial began on February 7, 2017, in the Nevada District Court. It was a high-profile event that was covered by all national television channels. Lewis Palmer, who at that time had already been discharged from the service for health reasons, became the main prosecution witness. His appearance in the courtroom caused silence. He walked to the stand slowly, leaning on a cane, although his legs were physically healthy. The problem was coordination. His body still remembered the strain of those 7 days in the desert. When the prosecutor asked Luis to identify the person who put the death box on him, the former ranger did not hesitate. He pointed to Kaufman, who was sitting at the defense table with a stony expression. Palmer's testimony was dry, devoid of emotion, but every word recorded by the stenographer drove the nail in the defense's coffin. He described in detail the psychological pressure, the manipulation of his weight, and the lies about the explosives. It took the jury less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Victor Kaufman and his 2 accomplices were sentenced to life without parole in a maximum security federal prison. After the trial, the story of the ranger with the box gradually disappeared from the headlines. But for Luis himself, it did not end with the judge's verdict. He officially retired with honors, receiving the Medal of Honor from the Department of the Interior. However, he could not return to work in the park. The view of the endless desert that used to give him peace of mind now caused panic attacks. We are transported to July of 2017. Luis lives in a small 1-story house in the town of Paramp, Nevada. It is a quiet place surrounded by mountains where life is slow. His wife, Sarah, stayed with him through the hell of her husband's rehabilitation. She created an atmosphere of comfort in the house, trying to erase any reminders of Death Valley. But in the center of the living room, on a specially dedicated shelf above the fireplace, there is an object that will shock every guest. It is not an award, a wedding photo, or a souvenir. It is the same cardboard box with the Apex logo, still wrapped in the remnants of the gray reinforced tape that the policeman in the mine cut. It stands there like a relic, like an altar to the horror he experienced. Luis sees his therapist, Dr. Evans, twice a week. The recordings of their sessions reveal the depth of the transformation that this man has undergone. During one of the last meetings, Dr. Evans gently asked why Luis kept the object, as it was a symbol of lies and torture. The patient's answer was the final chord in understanding the human psyche in extreme conditions. "I know it's empty, doctor," Luis said, looking out the office window. "I know it was an illusion. But that box saved my life." "Do you think they were trying to kill me with it?" "No. They gave me a crutch." He explained that if he had known the truth, that the box was empty and safe, he would have panicked. He would have run. He would have tried to cross the salt marsh by running to get to help faster. In the heat of 122 degrees Fahrenheit, any active physical action leads to heat stroke in 30 minutes. His heart would have stopped before sunset on the first day. "I survived because I had a goal," he continued. "My goal was not to spill a non-existent liquid, not to move a non-existent sensor. It made me go slowly. It made me look for a flat surface. It forced me to save my breath. The fear of the explosion kept my metabolism going. I survived because I believed the lie. Sometimes the truth kills, but the illusion gives you a chance." The story ends in the evening of the same day. The sun is slowly sinking behind the jagged ridge of the Funeral Mountains, a name that translates to Funeral Mountains, which sounds ominously symbolic. Luis sits in his rocking chair on the porch. The air is still as hot as it was a year ago. He looks out to the sunset, his face calm, almost impassive. But the camera goes lower, focusing on his hands, which are resting on the armrests of the chair. They are not relaxed. The fingers slowly, rhythmically bend and unbend, forming a square outline in the air. His palms are tense, the muscles in his forearms are taut as strings. Even when he is safe, in his home, free from criminals in the desert, his body continues to carry its load. Luis Palmer will forever remain there in the mine, holding an emptiness that weighs more than any stone on earth. His hands will never be free, because they still hold what saved him, taking away his peace in return.